community who are participating. As happy that all of you are present on this platform. We are extremely grateful to our resource persons who have kindly agreed to share their expertise with us. I'm sure everyone will utilize this great opportunity to engage with different minds and start reading on new areas of research. We are also immensely happy to reconnect with our alumni, colleagues, and friends from all institutions. I wish this program every success and declare the series open. May it be a season of academic and cultural enrichment. All the very best to each one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gokarn. I'd like to now invite Ms. Radhika Rani to introduce our resource person.
Thank you so much, Rashmi. Hi, everybody. Our distinguished speaker for today is Dr. Bernadette Luciano. She is a professor of Italian in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Auckland. She has researched extensively and also published on Italian cinema while training her lens on women in the Italian film industry, female characters, and their representation in contemporary Italian cinema. Along with these, her research interests intersect the domains of film adaptation, the theory and practice of translation and subtitling, and issues of identity, migration, and transnationalism in literature and film. Dr. Luciano is a feminist film scholar, and we are honored to have her as the first speaker on CIP's maiden lecture series. Welcome, Dr. Luciano. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you, Rashmi, and thank you everyone at St. Xavier's for inviting me to participate in this lecture series. It's really an honor for me to be here this evening. And as Rashmi and some of you know, I did visit you just over a year ago, and it was lovely to meet students and faculty in person. And in lieu of that, since we cannot do it in that way, I'm very, very happy to be here tonight to talk to you virtually. So I hope that you will learn something and from the lecture, learn something new and enjoy it. I'm going to be focusing on a very interesting phenomenon in Italian cinema in recent years, and that is sort of a revisitation, a new way of looking at cinema as a representation of the real. The lecture is going to focus on 3 films as case studies, but I'm structuring the lecture in 3 parts because I'm aware that many of you probably don't know much about Italian cinema. And so I hope for those of you who do, you don't find this repetitive in any way. But the first part is going to provide some context. The second part will be devoted to each of the 3 films that is a case study. And since these films are films that are quite recent and you may not be familiar with, I'm going to introduce them and also include a trailer. A slight warning in advance is one of the trailers has subtitles in English. Unfortunately, the other 2 don't have subtitled versions, but I'm hoping that they will still be able to give you a sense of the film and of the characters and of the spaces that the film occupies, which is what I'm most interested in the lecture. And then I will provide some sort of more comparative observations that focus on the main tropes and topics that I'm going to be exploring in the films. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is share my screen and start the PowerPoint presentation. Let me. Okay, so everyone can see the screens visible and you can hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, if that's the case, then we'll start. As you see, the title of the presentation is Reinventing the Real in Contemporary Italian Cinema. And so I'm just going, and what you see on here are the three films that I'm going to be looking at, films from around 2014. All of these were very well received critically and were presented in 2 different years at the festival in Cannes. And one is called Intervallo, Interval, Cuori Puri, Pure Hearts, and Fiore. So. Sorry, there we go. I'm going to begin with a quote from a recent chapter in a book on contemporary cinema by a woman named Giovanna Taviani, who's a filmmaker in her own right, and also the daughter of one of the famed Taviani brothers, very well-known filmmakers in Italy. And she comments in this work on the desire among young filmmakers of today, of the third millennium, to re-engage with both the realist and the documentary style of the cinema of the past. And as you see by the words that she uses, seeing, witnessing, documentary become once again part of the imaginary. And in these introductory words that I've put up here, she talks about how the current generation of filmmakers is returning to reconsider the values of the great cinema of the post-war. And she raises quite important names. She draws attention then to a new kind of cinema that's made by filmmakers that are strongly linked to a cinematic tradition, who are interested primarily really in interrogating reality by reinventing the realist tradition through films that draw attention to the relationship between fiction and the real world or the material world. And Taviani, in this quote, in her naming of the directors, harks back to the great filmmakers of neorealism. And she mentions here De Sica, Visconti, Rossellini, whose films in the post-war period paved the way for a new aesthetic in Italian cinema that also impacted on many other Italian film traditions to come. So when we discuss any representation of the real in Italian cinema, it's really not possible to do so without referring to neorealism, even though I must say that some subversive critics in recent years have actually called for a moratorium on the term and suggest that we think about things in a slightly different way. But there have been numerous and sometimes contradictory and attempts by critics and filmmakers to identify neorealism's aesthetics, political, and production characteristics. We have here, for example, one of the most well-known film historians who talks about neorealism as really fundamental. There's no moment in post-war film history as fascinating as Italian realism, he states. One of the foremost critics, André Bazin, actually called neorealism a cinema of fact or of reconstituted reportage. And in a more recent study on neorealism and revisitations of neorealism, Di Martina, Verdicchio, and others have called it a practice of looking at the real against dominant discourses, opposed to an aesthetics that presumably defines a national discourse. Now, I guess just to, before, as we move into this lecture, just to maybe sum up what neorealism might involve and might entail and how future realisms engage with this, we can think of it as, I think, an interdependence between themes, so real life stories, working class, and everyday people. The broader social historical context of neorealism is really important. It's films that focus very much on World War II and the post-war period and the social problems of that time. In forms of in terms of production, it's very interesting in its use of real locations, non-actors as authentic participants, improvised scripts, and finally, it's experimental realist aesthetics, which consists of long takes, diegetic sound, and what has been called by Gilles Deleuze and others a sort of wandering approach that moves away from the traditional narrative conflict that we're so familiar with in cinema. Now, generations of Italian filmmakers have consciously or unconsciously regularly returned to reappropriate and renegotiate what have been flagged as neorealist stylistic elements, but indeed neorealism's shadow has extended beyond Italy, as the many contributors to recent studies on neorealism in global cinema suggest the similarities between the historical and ideological context in Italy from the mid-1940s and the 1950s to various periods and indeed to many contemporary situations in the world today, which explain the popularity of neorealism among contemporary politically committed filmmakers from other national cultural identities. And these are examples, those were the international examples of international films that appropriate neorealism. These are examples of Italian films, more recent films that either parody neorealism or have explored it in other ways, including films by quite noted filmmakers as Pasolini and more contemporary filmmakers as well. Now, an element of neorealism, which will be central to what I'm going to be talking about today, is the relationship between the characters and the landscape in which we find them. So how the character looks at and experiences the world, wandering through it, or indeed sometimes trapped within it, is an integral part of neorealist cinema. The ambulatory, aimless movement central to these narratives explains actually the crucial role of the child in neorealist cinema, since, as Deleuze has reminded us, in the adult world, the child is often affected by certain motor helplessness, but a certain helplessness which makes them all the more capable of seeing and hearing. Now, the title of my paper takes its idea, its notion of reinventing the real from a contemporary critic and filmmaker in his own right, Dario Zonta's 2017 book that's called The Invention of the Real, L'invenzione del Reale. And it features conversations with 10 contemporary filmmakers whose very innovative and hybrid works employ both traditional documentary and narrative film strategies and contribute to a renewal of Italian cinema. Now, they engage in a cinematic language that challenges those notions of reality that are defined by entitlement and delusion that were created, proliferated, and endorsed by the former Italian Prime Minister, Silvio Berlusconi, who has a big media empire and videocratic reign in Italy. So the category of films that I refer to do their best to try and defamiliarize audiences from what is otherwise a very uncritical image of the world and seek to counteract the effects of the collusion between capital, politics, and media. So these films are alternatives to films like the ones that you see pictured here, the very kind of homogenous, comedic, bourgeois stories of films like Amore 14, Love 14, or As You Want Me. So the alternative films that we are talking about engage in a production style and a cinematic language that problematizes and complicates such notions of reality. Zonta refers to this cinema as l'altro cinema, the other cinema, because it's not strictly documentary, nor is it solely fictional, but neither is it docufiction. These are films that engage with the real at the level of a particular method and approach, source or inspiration, and dramaturgy. In these films, the real is altered, folded, transformed into new forms of narration. The method influenced the aesthetic. The trajectory of the film and its production determines the result. The how renders the what. In other words, the final product emerges through the method that's undertaken. So my presentation today, I'm going to consider 3 films as examples of this kind of new method. And they are, as I said, Intervallo by Leonardo de Costanzo, Fiore by Claudio Gianese, and Cuori Puri, Pure Hearts by Roberto De Paolo. So what I'm going to try and show is how the realism and the affective impact of these films derives from the methodology and the approach that's embraced by their filmmakers, who all come from a background in documentary filmmaking. And I've chosen these films in particular from a number of films that I could have selected because they revisit in a new way one of the fundamental figures of neorealistic cinema, and that is the child or adolescent that's relocated in a contemporary, particular time and place, and marked also by a certain linguistic register. Finally, it's not just the child, but it's the encounter that I think is going to be key to the presentation today and that we're going to look at a number of different levels. So while sharing elements with their neorealist predecessors, the films diverge from them as they move from what we might call a cinema of experience, which is how people often refer to neorealism. It was called a cinema of experience because it was a cultural movement where not only filmmakers, but also writers spoke collectively about the personal experience of a very particular historical moment, the war and the post-war period, and its shared past. So I'm going to refer to this cinema instead as a cinema of inexperience, because it's a cinema that instead is motivated by a certain curiosity. We might call it an anthropological or a documentaristic curiosity that presupposes actually not engaging and departing from one's own experience, but venturing beyond one's personal experience. So in this way, the films move away from the neorealist model, a model in which the filmmakers spoke collectively about personal experience. They also move away from previous waves of Italian filmmaking, such as another kind of political engaged films that we saw in the 60s and the 70s, which were based on a more investigative journalistic style. And they also move away from the very personalized, inward-looking kind of filmmaking of the 80s and 90s that was dominated instead by a certain kind of self-reflexivity. So the stories in these films that we're going to talk about today are born from the filmmaker's inspiration or idea and are only crafted or created after an experience with the marginal realities previously unknown to these filmmakers and coming into contact with the people that inhabit these realities, who in turn often become the co-script writers and the non-professional actors of the films. Their personal stories and their emotive engagement with the space drive the narratives, which are never primarily about the places themselves, but about reinventing the feelings that these places and that the characters themselves evoke. As I said above, one of the tropes of neorealism that the films adopt and extend is that of having children or adolescents as protagonists. As the British critic Mark Cousins states, there is a long symbiotic relationship between childhood and cinema. Dating back, he argues, to Lumiere's 1895 Les Repas des Bébés, a 41-second home movie of the director's niece, eating breakfast. Now, the child protagonist and their relationship to their culture and their geographic landscape has long been a feature of Italian film, where the child served as what was often called a window to another, less familiar way of exploring and viewing the landscape. Truffaut claimed that the Italian director Rossellini was actually the first to depict children truthfully on film, in an almost documentary-like style, as serious and pensive individuals, more so, in fact, than the adults in the world that surround them. The gaze of the child has ranged from that of witness, innocence, hope, comprehension, and compassion, to disillusion and recognition of the impossibility of change. Children have also frequently been symbols of the possibility of individual, societal, national, and familial regeneration. In Italian neorealist film, the child is often represented in one or more of these alternative perspectives, and is usually, not surprisingly, a boy who is often coupled with a father figure for symbolic reasons. In the post-war landscape of the absent, dead, or ineffectual fathers or father figures as a result of fascism, the boys are left to carry on the nation, to carry the nation forward at the end of many neorealist films. In my early project on Italian women filmmakers, I explored 3 films, Mobbing, Domenica, and The Island, which engage with but challenge that neorealist agenda by adopting, instead of a boy's point of view, a female child's point of view. So they have in common that they are both acknowledging and trying to come to terms with the father of Italian cinema, while also taking the discourse beyond it. All 3 are set at the beginning of the 21st century. Their protagonists are young women who inhabit a landscape that is significant to the film's project. In the first one, Mobbing, Francesca Comencini replaces De Sica's father-son relationship with that between a mother and a daughter, focusing on the inherent affinities and tensions and the oppressive social climate that influences the story. Bicycle Thieves can be considered a pretext to Comencini's film as a critique of social and economic conditions that impinge heavily on human relationships, and in particular on the parent-child relationship in an urban Roman landscape, past and present, that is a fundamental player in both narratives. Domenica, whose title, which is a girl's name, but also is the word for Sunday, refers to the name of its female protagonist and features a young orphan girl who skillfully negotiates a pulsating and crazy Naples. The film recalls and reinvents the many street-savvy orphan children and urban landscapes that were depicted in the realist Italian tradition, from neorealism through to Pasolini to the more recent wave of films by Neapolitan filmmakers. Quattriglio's L'Isola, set on the Italian Sicilian island of Favignana, engages with the tradition of neorealism by locating the narrative on the social and geographical margins of Italy. In L'Isola, there are clear visual references to another famous Sicilian filmmaker, Luchino Visconti, and his La Terra Trema, and to Roberto Rossellini's Stromboli, Land of God. Unlike its predecessors, however, Isola uses the perspective of a carefree young girl on the verge of adolescence to explore the rituals, landscape, and contradictory nature of the island's boundaries. Neorealism represents a body of Italian films in which landscape becomes a privileged site of meaning. Marginal or rural landscapes are often central to the film's project of reclaiming Italy for an anti-fascist identity, as opposed to being simply monumental landscapes. The neorealist re-inhabiting of lived urban and rural landscapes is tied to the reconstruction of the nation. The films discussed above continue to refashion the landscape, depicting the landscape instead as a feminized space inhabited by women. On the one hand, by citing the neorealist masterpieces, they establish a continuum between the projected past and the spectator's present. On the other, by moving beyond the post-war concerns about the crisis of patriarchy and the symbolic loss of father figures, they propose a new cinema for a new national landscape. In this other cinema, if not in the material world, there is a place for the othered women, the mothers and daughters, the society dominated by dysfunctional family relationships, mistrust, and fear. The films are located in what we might call a doubly marginalized space, not only on the peripheries of Italian cities, reflecting the increasing decentering of the Italian landscape, but they are set on the margins of the margins, in difficult to access places, an abandoned mental hospital, an adolescent detention center, a peripheral world comprised of Rom gypsy camps and Catholic youth groups. The stories born from the filmmaker's inspiration or ideas are only crafted after inhabiting these spaces and coming into contact with the people that inhabit them, who, as I said, become the co-script writers and the non-professional actors of the films. Their personal stories and emotive engagement with the space drive the narratives in these films, which are about reinventing the feelings that these places invoke. Attraction and repulsion coexist in a context of emotional deficit, where the characters and the spectators alike come to discover what Rossellini refers to as the essential tenerezza, or gentleness or kindness that has to be at the core, he thinks, of any artistic work or any film. So we can turn now finally to the films themselves. The first film that we're going to talk about is Cuori Puri. So like many scripts for neorealist films, Cuori Puri, or Pure Hearts, was inspired by a story that the director, Roberto De Paulis, came across in the local media. So the story was about a young girl that had reported to the police that she had been raped by 2 gypsy moms. It turns out that it wasn't true, that she'd made up the story, and that it was her Catholic guilt over having sex that had driven her to her accusation. Roberto De Paulis' film was driven by his interest in exploring the motivation behind the girl's lie. Initially, he tried, along with his screenwriters, to invent a plausible story. But in a public conversation in Rome where he talked about the film, he admitted that, and I'm quoting now, 4 middle-class, atheist Roman men couldn't find their way into a story about a 16-year-old girl who belonged to the Christian church group. So they decided that they had to embark on a documentary-like strategy, on what we often refer to as la ricerca sul campo, or field work, to explore the unfamiliar neighborhoods of East Rome where the events actually occurred. So they spent the subsequent 6 months in the immigration centers, the Rom camps, and the churches that host the Christian youth groups, and that led to the encounters that were fundamental to the film's story, including an encounter with a person who would eventually become the film's principal male protagonist. So they went in search of the story, and through searching for the story, they also searched for the people who could enact the story, but also write and produce the story. So the non-professional actors that were selected for the film were allowed to freely adapt their lines, to move as they wanted, to bring their own language onto the set, with the camera filming without the use of any artificial lights or any predetermined framing. So Cuori Puri's documentary style meant that it resulted in a story that took form eventually in the editing room. Now I'm going to begin by showing you this clip from the film, which is actually the trailer of the film. So this should give you some indication of some of the characters themselves, the two main characters, as well as some of the peripheral characters and the spaces that the film inhabits. Oh.
Sta cazzata hai preso? Queste cose fatte, no? Sta lavorando in parcheggio, non è fa la guardia, è diverso. Fa la guardia al parcheggio, poi tu stai zitto, ma il parcheggio.
Grazie Gesù per averci adottate nella tua vita.
Gesù è come il navigatore della macchina. Perché fa il navigatore quando sbagliate strada, quando vi perdete, no? Mica dice, ma ora ammazzato, avevo detto gira a sinistra, sei andato a destra, vai! No, ricalcola il percorso, vi riporta sempre a casa. Già ti sei fatto che c'è dal centro commerciale. Io ho la fila di gente qua fuori che mi sta chiedendo lavoro. La fila per fare guardie zinghi.
Vedi, rifugiati, ecco, siamo a finire come questi noi.
Fine colpa mia. Questi chi sono? I vicini. Come ti chiami?
Agnese,
Stefano. Che?
ti volevo ringraziare.
Non va tranquillo. Beati i puri di cuore perché vedranno Dio, un'iniziativa che sostiene i ragazzi che hanno deciso di arrivare in castità al matrimonio.
Perché tu ci devi ancora pensare? Sì, come tutti gli altri. È una mia scelta. Cioè, come sai quando ti devi fermare? E lo sa Dio quando mi devo fermare. Come sei stata, Agnese? Parlami, Ho fatto una domanda, no? Agnese! Io voglio rimanere pura.
Tu sei pura.
Okay. Pure Hearts begins with a chase. In the opening scene, which you saw at the very beginning of the trailer, Agnese is running down a road on the outskirts of a city. Stefano is chasing after her. He catches up with her, and we discover that she is running away from the nearby shopping mall where she has stolen a cell phone. We later learn the reason. That's because her mother had taken hers off her for exchanging what she thought were inappropriate texts with a friend. Stefano is a security guard in the shopping mall, whose job it is to catch her and turn her in. But instead, he inexplicably sets her free, cell phone and all. They part ways, and the film proceeds with the narrative cutting between the spaces that comprise their two separate worlds. 18-year-old Agnese lives in an overprotected, claustrophobic environment with her single mother. They even share a bed, and her mother is obsessed with her daughter maintaining her virginity until marriage. Agnese belongs to a youth church group, which advocates the same. Agnese, on the other hand, is struggling with issues of identity and her sexuality, and she's frightened by it, as she is of anything in the world unknown to her, outside her home and church group. Stefano, on the other hand, is a 25-year-old, affiliated with a tough crowd. His best friend is a local drug dealer, who even gets him involved in bullying a local immigrant who runs a convenience store. He has to learn to look after himself on the street from a young age because his unemployed parents have trouble making ends meet. They are about to be evicted by their own home, relegated to a camper, which puts them on equal footing with the refugees, the intruders, the immigrants that they fear and loathe. Having lost his job in the shopping center because of his failure to turn in Agnese, he's given one more chance in a parking lot to work as a parking lot attendant for a supermarket adjacent to the Rom gypsy camp, a place where the tensions between the Italians and the Rom run high. Stefano's isolation and his anger are represented in his position, seated in a broken down chair in the middle of an asphalt jungle, where there is no protection from the pelleting rain or the scorching sun, facing the men in the camp across the fence who glare back at him. Their mutual imprisonment breeds mutual contempt. Stefano and Agnese meet in this location, literally on different sides of the fence, when the girl accompanies her mother to the camp to deliver charitable goods. From this encounter are born stolen moments at the beach, where the sea serves as a liberating metaphor that counters the claustrophobia and alienation they feel in the problematic and dysfunctional worlds they inhabit. But when they make love for the first time, Agnese is confused by her clash of personal desire and instilled values, and so she invents the lie that is the premise for the story that De Paolo sets out to write and produce. So Pure Hearts, as the title suggests, situates virginity at the center of the film. Agnese's body, her female virginity, parallels Stefano's desire for a sort of territorial virginity in the parking lot. Two bodies or spaces that resist contamination, spaces that need to be defended from the other. The pure hearts of the film, Stefano and Agnese, are hearts initially fixed in their understanding of the world, but their encounter also leads to a desire to break out of their respective prisons, to come to grips with their fears, and to reconsider their place in the world. De Paolis' images of the external and internal spaces of a marginal role and the movement of the characters in them reflects the tensions that animate these two young people, lost in an urban environment where behavior is predicated by fear and loathing. The film's final chase scene, like its other representations of the city, maintains a non-judgmental, non-ideological, open-ended view of this contested urban setting, moving away from ethically charged, codified representations of priests, Roma, and immigrants. Similarly to De Paolis' film, set in the peripheral communities of Rome, where he reinvented a story of young people navigating within its various socio-geographic boundaries, Giovannese's film theme of video and cinema language so as to prepare them for the writing of the and primarily ex-detainees. Even the roles of the assistants of the prison guards are played for the most part by real guards themselves. The character selected to play the main role, Daphne, the character and the actor, by the way, have the same name, is in the end a non-professional actor from a similar background as the character she portrays. So again, now I'm going to show you the trailer, and this trailer, as I said, does not have subtitles, but I think you'll be able to follow again the idea of the characters themselves and the spaces where we find them.
Ferma, alza le mani. Fammi vedere le mani. A terra. Fammi vedere le mani. Bene.
Non è raggiungibile. Aveva detto che veniva oggi.
Basta! Basta!
Chi te l'ha fatti?
Ho disegnato io. Tu ce l'hai?
Poi è mio padre.
Tatuaggio con nome mio si è fatto.
Mi manca ancora un anno, però se chiedo l'affidamento in prova a caso che te posso uscire da qua.
Non è il momento. Io non me la sento, deviamo l'impegno del cielo adesso.
Certo.
Ma tu perché sei qua dentro?
Rapina, tu?
Pure io per rapire. Piacere comunque, Josh,
Daphne.
tu ce l'hai qualcuno fuori?
No,
Se fai domanda ti posso dare un giorno di permesso.
veramente.
Sei contento o no?
Lo posso leggere almeno? Non lo puoi leggere. No, cosa ha dato la detenuta?
Ma ti è un pupazzetto, non è una bomba.
So guardie.
Tra un anno ci vediamo fuori, liberi, dov'è che vuoi andare?
A Ibiza, perché c'è il sole, il mare, la festa,
E allora ci andiamo insieme ad Ibiza, ti va?
Canari.
Okay, the film begins with a scene that's not present in the trailer, but that I'm just going to describe because it's quite important, and it defines Daphne's survival strategy in the Rome in which she lives. What she does is she regularly hangs out with a friend in the train station and steals cell phones from unsuspecting strangers at knife point. There would be a whole discussion of cell phones to be done about these films as well. The trailer begins showing Daphne fleeing to avoid the authorities, then her arrest and incarceration. Inside the detention center, Daphne clashes with other inmates and continues to hope in vain on the assistance from her father, played by a very well-known actor, Valerio Mastandrea, who continues to not answer her calls or return her calls. Daphne's father, who we eventually see, is like the other parental figures featured in these films, whose own problems, he's recently been let out of prison himself and he's trying to start a new life, makes it difficult to provide support for their children. While he clearly loves his daughter, he lacks the economic or emotional resources to return the affection she longs for. Daphne's desire for affection is transferred to Josh, a male detainee convicted of a similar crime. In the detention center, the relationship between Daphne and Josh develops, notwithstanding limited mobility and physical barriers through the secret exchange of notes, of gazes from cell to cell, of brief stolen conversations that escape the attention of the guards. In Fiore, Giovanese's camera is always either on Daphne or showing us the world from her point of view. Inside the prison, his documentary style of filming captures the monotonous routine of an imprisoned Daphne through her fits of anger, mistrust, fights, and the many barriers to human contact, barred windows, fences, closed doors. One of the very few scenes that takes place outside these confines is their longed-for trip to the seaside with her father and Romanian stepmother, where Daphne dangerously plays with crossing the boundaries of her temporary license of freedom as she runs with the sand beneath her feet. This is one of a few seemingly direct references in the film to Truffaut's well-known film on adolescent rebellion, The 400 Blows. Like Quadripuri, Fiore avoids over-dramatization, ideology, and sentimental blackmail. It doesn't condemn Fiore's father, haters who have to enforce the rules of the institution while displaying sympathy. As one critic notes, there is no rhetoric in Giovanese's camera work, but only raw refiguration of a reality that in and of itself is already cruel without needing to highlight that cruelty. As in Quadripuri, the film's final chase defies resolution or closure, offering an open ending which privileges the young protagonist. The third film is Intervallo, the second feature film of the director De Costanza, who aims to bring to fiction film that which interests him in documentary, the unpredictable. The films seen are almost entirely set in the 200,000 square meters of the ex-Leonardo Bianchi psychiatric hospital in Naples, built in the 19th century and since abandoned. So you see that the space here in these two images. This space becomes the setting for a film which recounts the events of a day spent by two adolescents in the interior and exterior spaces of this building, cut off from the reality of the world that surrounds them. Unlike the films previously discussed, L'Intervallo was carefully scripted, that the dialogues, gestures, and the inflections of the spoken language of the two non-professional actors, the film is spoken entirely in Neapolitan dialect, are essential, and this film had to be subtitled even for the Italian public. And again, the final clip.
Ostiana part, o nero bianco, chic.
Non sto con nessuno.
Ma si scende,
Tutto a posto. Come si sta comportando?
E Simone Fuio?
Ma che vuoi?
tempesta.
Va, aspetta, va.
Ragazza, qui non c'è. Sì. Ah, visto.
Veronica, come ti trovi sull'isola? Credo proprio che mi ha cambiato la vita. E con Salvatore come ti trovi?
Okay, the unsubtitled clip and its non-chronological sequences might be a bit confusing, but should provide a sense, I hope, of the tension that the film is built on. An external criminal world with its rigid laws that control the lives of the two local adolescent protagonists. The film begins at dawn with the voice of Salvatore, the boy, off screen, recounting the seemingly strange habits of some birds. Certain songbirds that live in cages won't fly away, even if you open the door. They might hurl themselves against the cage, but in the end, they stay in a corner, tempted, but they do not take flight. They can't find the courage to do so. The anecdote of the behavior of these songbirds becomes a metaphor for the events that follow. It's the stringent, unwritten law of the local patriarchal world that bring the two protagonists together in this space. Veronica is a rebellious young girl who challenges those laws and is thus locked inside the abandoned structure for a day by the local bosses to be watched over by Salvatore. Note the name, it means savior, and he will play a role as her savior in the film. And he is a local boy, a vendor of lemon ices, whose well-being depends on keeping the local bosses off his back. Now, the initial unease between Veronica and Salvatore, who is an embarrassed guard who's not at all interested in being a captain, and the defiant girl who feels insulted and superior, sets up the initial dynamic that slowly transforms in the course of the film. From the early scenes shot within the confines of the abandoned structure, the cinematography sets up this sort of choreographic dance that alternates two shots which position them alternately in the foreground and in the background, with close-ups of each observing the other or looking out into that world that they are barred from or for the day. Now, this day of imprisonment becomes paradoxically, as the title suggests, an intervallo, an interval, an intermission, a day of freedom and reprieve from the laws that govern the outside world that humiliates and stifles them. The initially detached and surly behavior made up of silences and minimalist phrases between them that they exchange to defend themselves dissolve into unexpected camaraderie, that's born from very simple gestures. A shared sandwich, for example, or Veronica's disinfecting spit on Salvatore's wound. These children, forced by their circumstances into premature adulthood, gradually revert back into the naive children they never were. This becomes particularly true in the second part of the film, where the discovery of the abandoned boat that you saw in the clip, floating in the sewer, becomes a site of imaginary travel in the stories of each that interest each of them and that reflect their respective personalities. Veronica's imagined navigation shipwrecks her on a deserted island that's inspired by a reality TV show. Well, Salvatore's finds him on a legendary journey beyond the equator to Madagascar, inspired by literature. Now, the two also share local legends passed down by their grandmothers, stories told to frighten them, not unlike the urban myths that haunt the space of the mental hospital, or that they remember in the course of the day, of the local girls who either committed suicide or were murdered for their transgressions. This interval in a world temporarily removed from the psychological torture they suffer in the outside world, inside, sitting on the brink, looking out at that world, they can imagine a different future for themselves. Facilitated, perhaps, by an earthquake that would naturally, would naturally eliminate all of those out there who stand in the way of a different life, of their freedom and of their dreams. The darkness that comes with the end of the day brings with their new reality of the organized crime and patriarchal laws that rules their neighborhood. Veronica is warned about the implications of making the wrong choice. And in the end, the film is about how her desire to resist cannot overcome her will to live. So in these three films just described and discussed, the directors draw their spectators into geographical, cultural, and linguistic spaces beyond their personal experiences, ceding the point of view to their adolescent protagonists, played by non-professional actors who struggle in their relationship with an adult world and authorities, played often instead by professional actors, famous names often needed, in fact, for gaining financing. But these adults do not sustain them. They are imprisoned within physical or psychological walls. They break down their defensive barriers, which permit them to forge meaningful yet fragile relationships based on these encounters. These stories unravel as narratives of encounter, connected to the normally inaccessible spaces that the stories inhabit. Recounted from the adolescent's point of view, they are emotionally charged narratives that interrogate sites and situations of contemporary daily life via strategies inherited from the encounter between documentary and Italian neorealism and other cinematic realisms. Marked by that ambulatory and aimless movement that Deleuze ascribes to children in neorealist films, it is significant that all three films privilege the trope of flight. In Intervallo, there is a brief running scene where Veronica momentarily dreams of escaping her destiny in the community. But Veronica and Stefano become like the birds of the film's initial anecdote, flightless birds who separate in the film's final scene, recognizing the slim possibility for resistance in the community they inhabit. Cuori Puri and Fiore begin and end also with flight, with chase scenes, a running away from authority that pursues them, with an uncertainty of what they are running toward. In the final chase scenes, theirs is the aimless but hopeful running of youth trapped in a landscape that does not provide a way out. When Stefano finally catches up with Agnese in the film's final scene, they cling to each other in a desperate embrace. While Daphne and Joshua, running from authorities, collapse breathless onto a seat of a moving train. In these scenes where the camera chases after our actors, only to capture them both in two shots which unite them, we feel their breathlessness, a breathlessness that commingles the intimacy, hope, desperation of their youthful beating hearts. In these spaces of encounter, the films temporarily forget the limitations of time and space and leave us with the exuberant feeling of emotion transmitted by the actor protagonist. Cinema, even realistic cinema, is not only about telling a story or conveying a meaning, it's also about creating an affect, a moment-by-moment manipulation almost of feeling, inventing a moment which lodges itself under the skin of the spectator. As Hitchcock even said, you work hard to create an emotion, and once an emotion is created, you work even harder to maintain it. Emotion. Giuliana Bruno reminds us that cinema derives from the Greek word kinema, which connotes both motion and emotion. It implies more than the movement of bodies and object as imprinted in the change of film frames and shots of camera movement or any other kind of shift in viewpoint. Cinematic space, Bruno tells us, moves not only through time and space or narrative development, but through inner space. Film moves and fundamentally moves us with its ability to render affects and in turn to affect. The emotional rawness and the poetics of these films emerges from the methodology and approach followed by these filmmakers, living among and drawing out the rawness and the tenderness that emerges from their encounters with the people who became the protagonists and the actors of the film. This cinema of inexperience, initially driven by curiosity and anthropological investigation, encounters that create encounters, results in powerful final products that both navigate and reinvent the real and the emotions that are inherent to the margins that they inhabit and to the characters that live and relive them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Luciano. Excuse me. It's time to take some questions. We have some questions in the chat box, which I'd request Aditi to read out for you. And perhaps we could start with the question answer session. Aditi, yeah.
Okay, good evening. I will read out the question and you may answer them. The first question is by Emmanuel Dharma. You mentioned non-actors as a fundamental of neorealism. Could you please elaborate on what that term means?
Okay, so non-actors means non-professional actors. It means that the people who act in these films, and many of the neorealist films, for example, even in a film as famous as Bicycle Thieves, were children of the street. So people who lived in these environments. And directors, even under neorealism, would go around looking for people that they thought would suit those roles. For example, in the very famous film Bicycle Thief, the actor that plays the lovely young boy, who's really the center of the film, was chosen for the simple reason that the director liked the way that he walked. He liked his shuffle. And since that film, Bicycle Thieves, is all about really moving and walking around the city of Rome, and the movement of the boy within that space, that was a very important element. But so they are people who are not actors by profession. And this continues in the films that I talked about today. They are people who inhabit these spaces. They are not people who are trained as actors who have to try and invent and understand what the experience are. They are, as a sense, then more just acting out their experiences.
Okay, thank you. The second question is by Shruti Sharma. I would love to know more analytically about how these films end. This might help understand the use of tropes, if any, or whether they were meant to stand out in cinema.
Sorry, what was the last part of the? So I want to know about how the films
end.
How the film end?
More analytically about how the films end, so that she can come to know if there were tropes that were used.
Okay, so the films, interesting, the films end in a way with a kind of open ending. So the film are about encounter and emotion, and this emotion persists until the end of the film. But at the end of the film, you don't know where this is going to go. So it's left with these characters in that kind of space that they inhabit. But it's not a happy ending. It's not a conclusive ending. It's an ending that is left open to the viewer's interpretation.
Okay, got it. The third question is, why is neorealist cinema in most cases always focused on the lives of one or two individuals at a time?
Okay, because it's often based on a particular story that revolves around characters. So these characters move within the world and have a role in telling a particular story. So it's through engaging with that individual that you then become to understand the world. So it's getting into the character and the relationships that the character has that's also very important to neorealism.
Okay, thank you. The fourth question is by Mozart Gonzalez. He says, why are neorealism films mostly filmed on long and wide-angle shots? Is this something to do with conveying emotions?
Yes, I think so. It's part of the aesthetics of a neorealism film is to so, and it's not always, it's true that there are a lot of long takes and wide angle shots, and that is to locate also the characters in the world in which they live. So you're not just, so in a way, it creates some distance, but it also brings you into contact with the world that they're wandering through. So you see the characters also as part of their environment and part of the situation, the socio-economic situation in which they find themselves in. So they're not lone individuals. And so it's in a way, it's trying to keep away from what a close-up does, which is to bring you, to engage you extensively with a particular character outside of the space. So the space surrounding the individual and the world in which they live, and how these individuals actually, as I was saying, wander through the world, move through the world, and engage with that world and experience that world is very central to neorealist film.
Okay. The next question is by Merrick Pereira. Could you give us examples of neorealism cinema from recent films outside Italian cinema?
Well, there's lots of realist, we wouldn't call it neorealist film, but we would call it cinema that emerges in a realist vein. And every cinematic tradition really has it. I mean, I guess most famously maybe and most recognizably, we might think of Ken Loach's cinema as a kind of realist cinema that again engages with a particular social reality of its time and place. There's also a realist tradition in Indian cinema as well. So there's almost every tradition explores that notion of what it means to live in a particular socio-political moment and often on the margins of society.
Okay. Next, Alice asks, how do you think the tension between reality and fiction will be taken care of in contemporary Italian cinema?
how will the tension between, I think what's happening in Italian cinema, and actually in a lot of cinema, is that tension is becoming the most interesting part of cinema. It's not something that needs to be resolved. It's something that makes cinema interesting in understanding that there isn't really a clear-cut boundary between fiction and nonfiction. That in a sense, even if you think about even documentary, or if you think about nonfiction cinema, in a sense, these are also selected and created and edited in certain ways, and fiction cinema can take on real topics. And so I think that's what, it's this tension that's at the core of exploring directions in what cinema is actually doing. I mean, you can think about that even in a very recent film, the film that won at the Venice Film Festival this year, Nomadland, which explores, a real story in a way, and has real characters at the same time that it has Frances McDormand in there as the main, character. And it's situated in this place between reality and fiction, which is an interesting space to be.
Okay, the next is a very basic question by Angela. What is the difference between realism and neorealism?
Okay, realism is an umbrella term for all kinds of genres in literature and literary and studies and film studies and cultural studies that try and represent the real. Neorealism is a specific variant of that was located in a specific time and place in Italy in the post-war period, and was dealing with the issues of the time, at the same time that it was sort of extending some of these, exploring ways in which one could really represent realism, which were those sort of features that I was talking about, the use of the, the use of non-actors, the use of minimalist scripts, the shooting in real locations as opposed to studios. So you can have realism, a realist film, a film that tries to depict reality that is filmed in a studio. So it's a particular features, the combination of these features, the aesthetics, the production features, the time and place in which these films take place, that account for what neorealism is specifically.
Okay. Next question. Has Italian cinema invented any styles or methods of cinematography with regards to the subtext found in a particular type of shot?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat?
I'll repeat it. Has Italian cinema invented any styles or methods of cinematography with regards to the subtext found in a particular type of shot?
Well, I think if we think of some of the experimental films of filmmakers like Antonioni, I think his kind of experimentation with cinema, particularly with the wandering camera. I think we can think of that as, I think Antonioni's style would be relevant would respond to that question. Yeah.
Okay. So those are the questions.
Professor, will you be able to take one more question?
Okay.
There's one more question. This is by Mozart Gonzalez. Aditi, can you read out the question, please?
Yes, ma'am. Can neorealism films be commercial, or do they just pertain to a certain creative idea?
at the time that it came out, was portraying the harsh reality that people were living. And the tension, the thing about cinema is that we're often there with the question of what is the purpose of cinema, right? Should cinema engage us? Should it make us think? Should it educate us? Or should it entertain us? And so that's always a big divide. And one of the things about neorealist films, or some also maybe artistically challenging films, is that it's not what people are used to seeing or want to see as a form of entertainment. So there is a tension there. I think there's often this discussion between, the difference between art cinema and, more entertainment cinema.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for answering all the questions.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions. I think we'll. I think the next 15 minutes question answers. And
I can't answer the question. Somebody wants to specifically know why the bicycle is important.
Oh.
And is also asking about the names of some of those most important Italian neorealist directors, which is an important question. So Vittorio De Sica, Roberto Rossellini, who I mentioned several times. We often talk about Rossellini, De Sica, Visconti, and some of the most important films are Rome Open City and Rossellini's War trilogy, Paesà, and De Sica's film Umberto D, about an old pensioner and his dog, is considered, often the last film of neorealism. Visconti also. So the bicycle, why does the bicycle mean so much to the father in the bicycle thieves? Because the bicycle was what he needed in order to work. So the bicycle was linked to job and employment. At the beginning of the film, he's unemployed. He's unemployed, as many people were in the post-war Italy. And so he goes to looking for a job, and in order to have a job, he needs a bicycle, because his job is to go around riding on his bike, putting up film posters. Okay, so that's the reason, because the bicycle is important for him in order to be employed, to do his work, to make money for his family.
We're still receiving questions. I think I will forward them to you. I'm very aware of the time in New Zealand. So thank you for all the questions. We will certainly share those questions with Professor Luciano. And I think we can go to the next bit, which is the vote of thanks. And I'd like to invite Andrew to propose the vote of thanks.
Very good evening to all. It is my privilege to propose a vote of thanks as we draw near to the end.
Andrew, I think you have to be louder, please.
Okay. It is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks as we draw near to the end of the first of 4 lectures being organized by the Council of International Programs at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. On behalf of the organizing committee, it is my privilege to express my sincere gratitude to the management of our college, our rector, Dr. Father Keith D'Souza, our principal, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, for the unstinting support that they extend to each of our ventures. Our thanks are due to our vice principals, the vice principal for academics, Dr. Karuna Gokarn, vice principal for arts, Dr. Annapurna S., and vice principal for the sciences, Dr. Rishikesh Samant. I must take this opportunity to thank our esteemed speaker for the day, Professor Bernadette Luciano, the Associate Dean International, Faculty of Arts at the University of Auckland, for her thought-provoking lecture. Truly a learning experience for all of us in attendance. Ma'am, not only have you helped us to discover the real and contemporary Italian cinema, but you've also inspired in many of us a newfound love for Italian culture in its entirety. We are indebted to you for the precious time you've given us this evening, and we appreciate it very much that you've given us your time in spite of it being midnight in Auckland. We thank you very much, and we look forward to a continued association with you. Grateful thanks also to the faculty in charge of the CIP and the student volunteers whose immense dedication was so instrumental in ensuring that today's lecture was a grand success. Lastly, we are delighted to have had so many participants with us, both on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Thank you to all of you for your overwhelming response to our lecture series, and we hope to see many more of you for the lectures to come. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And we really hope to continue this association and these lecture series. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.